Get your hands up, now! Those were the first words James Parker heard echoing through the crisp night air as he stepped out of the downtown Washington, D.C. office building where he worked the late shift. The air was still, save for the hum of the city winding down. But in a flash, that calm was shattered. Red and blue lights lit up the street like a crime scene disco. He barely had time to process before he was slammed against the hood of a police cruiser, his backpack ripped from his shoulder, hands wrenched behind him. "What did I do?" he asked, his voice shaking, not just from fear, but from disbelief. The officers didn't answer. To them, he was just another suspicious black male. They shouted that he matched the description of a robbery suspect. A vague report had come in about someone lurking around a nearby jewelry store. No mention of a weapon, no real ID check, just black male, dark clothes, carrying a bag. That was all it took. As more officers swarmed, James could see pedestrians stopping to watch, some pulling out phones, some just gawking. In those few humiliating moments, he wasn't a man. He was a headline. They didn't ask his name, didn't check the ID in his wallet, didn't listen when he tried to explain that he worked in the very building behind them. The cops were riding high on adrenaline and assumptions. James remained silent after a while, not out of compliance, but out of practiced exhaustion. He had lived through enough microaggressions and profiling to know when talking was pointless. But what these cops didn't know was that James Parker wasn't just a janitor, and they had just made a colossal mistake. Unbeknownst to them, James had been quietly working undercover with the FBI for nearly a year. His role? Janitor by title. But his mission was far deeper. He was planted to infiltrate the building, which happened to house offices connected to a federal investigation into white-collar crimes, insider trading, and a potential national security breach. James was part of a deep-cover team gathering information about an executive suspected of laundering money through dummy corporations, some possibly tied to foreign entities. The janitor uniform was just a James Parker had swept floors. He'd taken out trash. He wore coveralls like every other janitor. But James was undercover, deep undercover. Beneath the mop and gloves was Special Agent James Parker of the FBI, operating under one of the most sensitive assignments of his career. For the past 11 months, he had worked silently and methodically within the gleaming towers of a prestigious Washington, D.C. office building, posing as an invisible worker, while secretly gathering damning evidence on a high-stakes financial crime ring. The criminal web ran deep. Executives laundering millions through shell corporations, influencing public officials, and potentially leaking classified data to foreign agents. James had to be careful. One wrong move could blow the entire operation. Every night while emptying wastebaskets and cleaning floors, he was also planting discreet surveillance bugs, copying confidential files, and collecting hard evidence. His presence was never questioned. To most of the building's occupants, he was just the janitor. But behind closed doors at FBI headquarters, he was a linchpin in an investigation set to bring down powerful figures, including CEOs, political donors, and even one sitting senator. He had just finalized a report that would trigger arrests, asset seizures, and a nationwide scandal. The mission was days from completion. That night, he was supposed to upload a final batch of encrypted files from a flash drive hidden in his work gloves. But everything unraveled in a matter of seconds. It all started with a 911 call. A vague report from a civilian claiming a suspicious black male was lingering near a jewelry store adjacent to the building. James, stepping out for his break, was wearing the same navy blue work clothes he always did, carrying his backpack with work files and his FBI-issued communication device inside. But to the responding officers, none of that mattered. All they saw was a lone black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cops didn't stop to ask questions. Guns were drawn before words were spoken. James complied instantly, not out of guilt, but out of survival instinct. As he was slammed into the police cruiser, he could feel the hidden flash drive press against his chest beneath his shirt. He didn't resist. He didn't reach for ID. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. Still, he tried to speak, explaining that he worked in the building, but the officers cut him off, mocking him. "You clean windows in a place like that? One sneered. "Tell it to the judge." Another officer rifled through his backpack, completely unaware that inside was a sealed folder labeled with federal clearance codes and an encrypted transmitter blinking softly in one of the side pockets. Back at the FBI field office, James was considered off-grid. His handlers were growing concerned. Every hour he didn't check in heightened the risk of compromise. Then, the distress signal triggered. The small device in his bag, designed to go off if he was forcibly detained or separated from his gear, sent a silent alarm up the chain. Within minutes, phones lit up at FBI headquarters. Tactical teams were alerted. Senior agents scrambled to figure out what went wrong. A trace led them to the local police department, the very one where James was now sitting in a holding cell, still handcuffed, still being interrogated by officers who had no idea who they were dealing with. Despite offering his real name and badge number multiple times, James was ignored. The officers laughed, accusing him of impersonating a federal agent, and even took photos of his credentials as a joke. He sat there, silent and furious, knowing the damage that had just been done. Every second he remained in custody, the larger operation was at risk. Files not uploaded, suspects not yet moved on, and surveillance compromised. And then, everything changed. Roughly 40 minutes after James was booked, a convoy of black SUVs roared into the station's parking lot. Out stepped agents in suits and tactical gear, badges out, eyes cold. The local officers barely had time to process what was happening before the station was swarmed. The ranking FBI agent in charge demanded James's release immediately, handing over court-authorized documents that confirmed his identity and undercover status. The room went dead silent. The arresting officers, pale and speechless, looked from the papers to James, still in cuffs, still silent. One tried to apologize, but the damage was done. Within minutes, James was released, escorted to safety, and taken to a secure debrief room. As the FBI descended on the precinct, an internal affairs complaint was filed automatically. The arresting officers were placed on leave pending investigation. The story didn't end there. Back at the station, the atmosphere was thick with arrogance and ignorance as the officers joked among themselves, entirely unaware of the storm they had just summoned. One of them snorted, "Janitor with an attitude, huh?" while another laughed, patting James's confiscated backpack like a trophy. "Let's see what he's hiding, maybe some stolen mops." The room filled with chuckles and smug grins, treating the situation like just another night of routine policing. James Parker sat silently, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs, but his face remained calm, too calm. Because inside, he wasn't just simmering with rage, he was calculating. Every second that ticked by was critical. The longer he stayed in this fluorescent-lit purgatory, the more likely it became that months of dangerous undercover work could unravel. The flash drive in his confiscated bag contained evidence that tied together a vast criminal network, corrupt executives, money laundering routes, political bribes, and even connections to international operatives. His silence wasn't submission, it was discipline, training. But still, under the sneering eyes of officers who never once questioned their own authority, James could feel the weight of injustice crushing down again, just like it had so many times before, not just against him, but against people like him. His badge, credentials, and voice meant nothing to them the moment they saw his skin and uniform. They hadn't even bothered to check the contents of his backpack properly. If they had, they might have noticed the federal surveillance device that had already triggered a silent alert. Then it happened. Just when the officers were settling in for what they thought would be another forgettable arrest, a deafening bang, bang, bang rang out through the station's front door, followed by a deep, commanding voice that silenced the room instantly. "Federal agents! Open the door." The laughter died. Mugs of coffee paused mid-air. The room tensed like a stretched wire. One officer slowly stood up, looking around for direction, confusion etched across his face. Another reached for his radio, stammering. Before anyone could react further, the door burst open, and chaos took over. A team of armed FBI agents swept in, bulletproof vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters, tactical rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the room with purpose. Their presence shifted the atmosphere from cocky to catastrophic in seconds. The lead agent stepped forward with a folder in one hand and a firestorm in his eyes. He pointed across the room to where James still sat, handcuffed, silently watching. "That man is a federal agent," the agent growled, every syllable sharp and deliberate. "And you just blew a 6-month undercover operation." Silence dropped like a hammer. The color drained from the officers' faces. One of them, the one who had been mocking James moments ago, stammered, "Wait, what?" The lead FBI agent tossed a stack of documents on the front desk. Court orders, clearance papers, the full scope of James's mission. "Your negligence just compromised a federal investigation involving organized financial crime, government, corruption, and potential threats to national security." He turned to look at James. "We've been trying to reach him for over an hour." The officer closest to James scrambled for the key to unlock the cuffs, hands visibly shaking. As the steel restraints clinked open, James stood up slowly, brushing off his sleeves, saying nothing. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. His calm amidst the panic, his silence in the face of their humiliation. It was power reclaimed. He walked past the same men who had thrown him against a car hood, who had laughed at his expense and didn't even glance their way. The FBI team surrounded him, shielding him from cameras and curious eyes as they escorted him out of the building and into one of the black SUVs idling outside. As the convoy pulled away, the stunned officers remained frozen in place, processing what had just occurred. Inside the SUV, James sat with the lead agent, who offered him a quiet nod of respect. "We've locked the building down," he said. "You'll be debriefed at HQ. The operation is still salvageable, thanks to your earlier uploads." James finally allowed himself a breath. The weight of months in hiding, the pressure of living 2 lives, the indignity of tonight, it all settled into a quiet fire in his chest. He had done everything by the book, sacrificed holidays, sleep, time with family, risked his life blending in where no one looked twice at the janitor. And still, the very system he worked to protect had turned its back on him in an instant. But this wasn't the end of his mission. No. If anything, it was the start of a much bigger fight. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, headlines were already swirling in local news outlets. Though the FBI attempted to keep much of the operation classified, leaks were inevitable. Whispers spread that the fallout was swift, unforgiving, and loud. Within hours of James Parker being extracted from the precinct, the FBI launched a full-scale internal review, not just of the mishandled arrest, but of the broken systems that allowed it to happen. The body cam footage left little room for doubt. It was all there in cold, high-definition detail. The crude remarks, the unnecessary force, the smirking officers tossing racial jokes like candy, and the complete absence of protocol. The most damning revelation? There was no robbery suspect matching James's description at all. No active crime in the vicinity, no call with substance, just a vague report and a dangerous assumption. What followed was not an attempt to diffuse or clarify, but a display of unchecked bias and abuse of authority. When the truth emerged that James was a federal agent, not only was public trust shattered, but law enforcement agencies across the city found themselves under a glaring spotlight. The arresting officers were suspended within 24 hours. One, perhaps realizing the depths of his error and the inevitable consequences, resigned before the week was over. The other faced a formal disciplinary hearing with possible federal charges, pending for obstruction and misconduct. Community outrage erupted like a firestorm. Protests organized by local civil rights groups surged through the streets outside the precinct. People held signs that read, "I am not a suspect, justice for James Parker," and "Our skin is not probable cause." News vans parked outside the police station for days. The city's police chief gave a carefully worded statement, calling the incident deeply troubling and promising accountability. But for many, the words rang hollow. James had become a symbol, not by choice but by circumstance, of everything that needed to change. Still, through it all, James remained grounded. Shaken, yes. Angered, absolutely. But not broken. He didn't do interviews. He didn't hold. press conferences. He politely declined offers from media outlets who wanted him to share his story, refusing to become a spectacle. He knew the mission wasn't over. While the arrest had jeopardized months of undercover work, not all was lost. With help from his team and supervisors, James helped redirect and repair the operation. Critical files had been secured just before his arrest. The FBI doubled efforts, working around the clock to shift timelines and tighten the noose on their targets. Within weeks, the operation concluded with a sweeping series of raids across multiple cities. 7 high-level executives were arrested, all facing charges ranging from fraud and tax evasion to conspiracy and money laundering. 3 politicians, 2 of them still holding office, were indicted for accepting bribes and abusing their positions to protect the crime network. Bank accounts were frozen, offshore holdings seized, and shell corporations exposed. The headlines were explosive, but one name never appeared: James Parker. And that's exactly how he wanted it. For him, the mission had never been about recognition. It was about justice. Justice for the people defrauded by billion-dollar schemes. Justice for the integrity of the badge he wore. And yes, justice for every black man who had ever been seen as a threat before a human being. Every time he looked in the mirror, he remembered that night. How quickly things escalated, how close he came to being just another statistic, and how easily the people sworn to uphold the law had betrayed it. James took a few weeks off after the operation wrapped. He spent time with his family, something undercover work rarely allowed. His mother cried when she saw him, having only been told he was working a dangerous assignment. His younger sister, a civil rights attorney, held his hand as they watched the news coverage in silence, knowing the layers of what had almost been lost. He met quietly with internal affairs, gave detailed reports, and pushed for better officer training programs, ones that emphasized de-escalation and racial bias education. But even then, he kept his profile low. When a prominent TV host reached out to book him for a nationwide exclusive, he turned it down flat. "I didn't go through all that to be famous," he told a colleague. "I just want it to mean something. I want it to matter." And it did. The incident sparked policy changes in the department that arrested him. New sensitivity training became mandatory. Community watchdog committees were established. The body cam footage was used in national training seminars as a case study in how not to police. And most importantly, it forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored, about profiling, power, and the dangerous consequences of seeing blackness as suspicion. James went back to work eventually, though not undercover. He shifted into a training and advisory role, helping develop programs for future agents of color, preparing them not only for the missions they'd face in the field, but for the battles they'd endure within the system itself. And yet, he carried that night with him always. The flashing lights, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the sound of laughter at his expense, and then the slam of FBI boots on the precinct floor, the reversal, the reckoning. He had lived the nightmare and survived it. Not everyone does. So while the world moved on to the next news cycle, James Parker kept working quietly, relentlessly, believing that real change doesn't come from a single headline. It comes from people who refuse to let injustice stand even when no one's watching. James Parker's story may sound like something ripped straight from the script of a Hollywood thriller, complete with undercover agents, corrupt executives, and a dramatic FBI raid. But beneath all the shocking turns and explosive reveals lies something far more unsettling and real. It's a story about perception, about assumption, about the quiet, everyday ways systemic injustice continues to shape lives, often invisibly, and almost always without consequence. Because while James happened to be a highly trained FBI agent working undercover, what if he hadn't been? What if he was exactly what the officers thought he was? A janitor, walking home from a long shift, minding his own business. Would anyone have listened to his cries of innocence then? Would the precinct have seen a man wrongly arrested or just another entry in a file they'd soon forget? That's the part that sticks. That's the haunting question echoing through every quiet moment of this story. James Parker, the federal agent, had the FBI to storm in and clear his name. But what happens to the thousands of black men who don't have that kind of backup? Who gets to rescue them? Who believes them? How many of their stories are quietly buried beneath paperwork, never making the evening news, never followed by accountability or apology? For every James Parker with a badge in his bag, there are countless others whose only crime was walking down the wrong street at the wrong time, with the wrong color skin. That night, those officers didn't see an agent. They didn't see a man with a mission, a hero risking his life to bring down a criminal empire. They saw a uniform, a face, and a narrative they've been conditioned to believe their entire lives. To them, James wasn't an individual. He was a symbol of suspicion, disposable, detainable. No questions asked. And that's where this story becomes more than a mistake. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of the ingrained biases that still poison the pillars of justice even today. Because this wasn't just about a few bad apples. This was about a system that allowed those apples to rot unchecked. It allowed a man's rights to be stripped away in front of witnesses. It allowed mockery instead of professionalism, aggression instead of inquiry. And it would have stayed that way, unchallenged and forgotten, if not for the unexpected twist that James was not who they thought he was. That twist didn't just upend the case. It exposed the cracks. It pulled back the curtain. It showed the world what far too many already knew, that the same uniform meant to protect can also oppress, and that power in the wrong hands can turn a routine stop into a life-altering nightmare. But James, through it all, remained composed, not because he wasn't affected, but because he knew his rage had to be channeled into action. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength sharpened by discipline and clarity. He understood the danger of that moment, of becoming another headline in a country that's already seen too many. Yet even as an agent, he wasn't immune to the trauma. That night changed him. It opened old wounds. It made him reconsider what his uniform really protected him from, and what it didn't. He realized that no matter how many badges you earn, for some, your skin is still the first thing they see. And even more painful was the realization that he was lucky. Lucky that his credentials carried weight, that the FBI was tracking him and acted fast, that his story had a dramatic enough twist to make people pay attention. Because not every story ends with vindication. Not every life interrupted by injustice gets repaired. Some are lost forever. James didn't take to the media circuit afterward. He didn't write a memoir or sign a movie deal. He turned down offers to become a public speaker, resisting the push to turn his pain into a packaged brand. Instead, he poured his energy into creating quiet change, inside the bureau, in the communities he served, and in the training rooms where he helped mold the next generation of agents. He began pushing for reforms, advocating for deeper diversity in federal law enforcement, better racial sensitivity training for local departments, and stronger partnerships between agencies and the communities they policed. He worked with quiet conviction, knowing real change wasn't flashy. It was slow, hard, and what happened to James Parker is a wake-up call for us all. The truth doesn't always come easy, but it's worth fighting for. If you were shocked by this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss more stories that expose the truth and fight for justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep shining a light on the stories that matter.